Ever put off a home maintenance project? Forget to cut your grass? Maybe your house needs repainting, but you can't afford it? Well, according to the Portland City Auditor, you're much more likely to get a fine for that if you're a person of color or live in a gentrifying neighborhood.
But I kept on getting fines, and they kept on going up. It was overwhelming. So I got up to $200 and I think $30,000. And then they said, they were going to foreclose on my house.
And now the kids are back in school full-time. Let's take a closer look at what's happening in the classroom, because school psychologists say they're seeing more and more students acting out.
We have students that, are being physical towards staff, biting, kicking, scratching.
And did you enjoy your extra hour of sleep this weekend? Or are you sick and tired of changing the clocks twice a year? Turns out, Oregon and Washington are both on board with getting rid of the time change. But actually making that happen, well, it's a little more complicated. Here's the story. Welcome to The Story. I'm Pat Doris. Maggie's still on vacation, so I'm still your host tonight. This is still the same show. Your feedback drives our content. All the ways to contact us right there at the bottom of your screen. You can email us at kgw.com, or email us at thestorykgw.com, otherwise we won't get it, or use the hashtag TheStoryKGW on Twitter. Now let's jump into the big story. It involves something that sounds minor but can really become a monster. And too often, according to the Portland City Auditor, that monster is sent to devour the poor or communities of color. Talking about a system set up in Portland 107 years ago. It allows anyone to complain about your property, and that can cost you dearly.
When I started designing, I just wanted peace.
In the North Portland neighborhood of Bridgeton, Jerry Duckett is a bit of a local celebrity for building this wall at the front of his property.
I was trying to make it peace.
But what got him in trouble with the city of Portland was not the wall, but his house. Back in 2007, someone complained and a city inspector found problems with the chimney and gutters and roof and peeling paint.
I was living in North Portland, and I just let it sit for a while. I wasn't living here, and it needed a lot of repairs.
He ignored the issue, exactly the wrong thing to do. The inspector issued fines.
Yes.
When Duckett did not pay, interest, penalties, and fees were added onto the fines, and then they were all rolled into a lien on the property, which means the city would get paid first if the home ever sold. And they just kept growing.
But I kept on getting fines, and they kept on going up. And it was overwhelming for me, and so I couldn't keep it up. So I got up to $200 and I think $30,000.
How much?
$230.
Did you believe that number?
I didn't believe it at first, and then they said, they were going to foreclose on my house.
The paint was peeling.
That was the whole thing?
That was it. That was it right there.
Wow. In Northeast Portland, Bruce Cushman had a similar experience in 2008 in his gentrifying neighborhood. Someone complained the trim on his house looked bad. Inspectors came over and fined him for deteriorating siding, a broken window, and that missing trim paint. This
was the second week of December, and the guy tells me I have to get up on a ladder and paint the fascia on my roof, and I told him, I can't do that. He said the inspector went away. Then the fine started. The thing is, Bruce said he lives on Social Security checks that total $927 a month and could not pay the fines. He was cited again in 2010 for doing renovations without a permit. The fine starts out at like $500. And then after, I think it was 90 days, it starts doubling. Just like with Jerry, Bruce's fines and fees and penalties grew and grew. He said he called everyone he could think of, but could not find a way to stop that runaway train. The city put a lien on his house, and the total climbed to $188,000. Recently, Portland City Auditor reviewed the system of complaints and fines and discovered several problems.
And what we found was that neighborhoods with a higher concentration of people of color and neighborhoods where the median home price had increased over the course of 5 years were also the neighborhoods that were most heavily impacted by the complaint-driven process.
The auditors reviewed more than 15,000 property complaints over a 6-year period involving owner-occupied properties. It created these maps to show where the most complaints per 100 households were, which in some areas comes dang close to matching the percents of population that had people of color. But hold on, I can hear you asking what's wrong with trying to improve the look of a neighborhood. I took that very question to the auditors. I could just see, so if a neighborhood is gentrifying, some people think that's awful and some people think that's good. But either way, I'm sure that there's a certain home value there. You have new people paying higher prices moving in, looking around saying, gosh, that sidewalk is going to trip me when I walk down it, or that house is in disrepair. Is that a bad thing to try and bring up the neighborhood?
The danger of gentrification is when the people who've lived in that neighborhood before all the services came in, before all the investment came in, are priced out and they're displaced out of their neighborhood. That's the danger of gentrification. And the city's complaint-driven property enforcement system is adding to the burden of that onto the homeowners who've already been living in that neighborhood. And that's what we're pointing out. And it doesn't mean that gentrification is bad. It's pointing out that there needs to be some steps taken by the city to ensure that they are not damaging and burdening the people who already live in these neighborhoods.
Another big problem the auditors highlight, the inspectors who check the complaints are paid with money raised by the complaint fines. That's what funds their budget. Some say that gives the department a reason to fine more people.
$208,000. It was a blessing from the city.
There are happy endings for both Jerry and Bruce. Jerry contacted the city's ombudsman in 2019. That's an office that handles complaints against the city. Someone from the city then called to say he'd been picked for a special program to review extreme cases like his, and all but $1,000 in fines were dropped. He connected with other programs that help low-income people fix up their homes, and his is underway. Bruce also found his way to the ombudsman office and got all but $6,000 erased. He said the remaining amount will disappear when he finishes this, his third and final remodel. Yeah. The Bureau of Development Services is in charge of that fine program. They're reviewing the program now to see if the city should even be involved with complaints that don't involve dangers at the property, and if so, how to fund the program in a different way and make sure it does not unfairly focus on the poor and communities of color. Now, let's talk about schools. Back in 2019, KGW investigated Classrooms in Crisis. It became a series where we heard from educators, bus drivers, parents, and about students needing help and acting out. Now, school psychologists say they're seeing more kids acting out at school this year. Christine Pitawanich spoke with psychologists at Oregon's 2 largest school districts.
2 school psychologists reached out for National School Psychology Week. They not only wanted to bring awareness about what they do, they also shared what they've been seeing in schools this year: more kids needing mental health help. This school year started with a mix of emotions. Coming off isolation from the pandemic, some parents, kids, and teachers felt excited about the return of in-person learning. Others were anxious. School psychologists say all the instability associated with the pandemic has contributed to a difficult environment.
This year just feels harder than last year.
I'm seeing an uptick in the need for behavior support plans for students.
Callie Ekberg, a school psychologist for Portland Public Schools, and Carly Strauss, who works at Salem Kaiser, say disruptive behaviors run the gamut.
And acting out could be, a lot of different things, from just sort of goofing off in class and making it a disruptive environment for the learning of others.
But in some of the more extreme cases, we have students that, are being physical towards staff, biting, kicking, scratching, like fleeing from the campus, climbing things that they shouldn't be climbing.
In KGW's Classrooms in Crisis series, which aired before the pandemic, we found a trend of students acting out. Both Strauss and Ekberg say they believe this uptick is part of the trend, but it's compounded by the isolation and stress of the pandemic.
That's something we are advocating for, is more support for mental health professionals in our schools, because we are definitely in a mental health crisis right now.
What's worse, they say many school psychologists are overloaded with students. The job is draining, especially, they say, when there are more kids who need their help. That's why they're hoping state and national leaders consider more funding to hire more school psychologists so they can better serve their students, families, and staff. Christine Pitawanich, KGW News.
All right, we love your questions. Keep them coming in. Let's get to a question from Doug that came into us. You guys have run several stories about our legislature passing a law eliminating seasonal time change. All of these have said it will be permanent daylight savings time. Well, the Oregonian on Saturday ran an article saying it would be standard time. So which is it? Well, excellent point. Let's dig in. Oregon and Washington have both passed legislation to make daylight saving time permanent. That is the time we're on between March and November. But this weekend, the Oregonian ran a story about why some researchers say actually staying on standard time would be better. Studies show heart attacks and car crashes, things like that, increase when we spring forward, and that more morning light is better for our health. So that's probably the story you saw, Doug. The states have voted for daylight savings. Some experts say standard time would be better. Thanks for bringing that up. The question is, if we wanted to get rid of that time change, how can we do it? Well, let's take a look.
We're all familiar with our twice-annual cue to spring forward or fall backward. But didn't Oregon and Washington get rid of this? Yes, we'll get to that. So why are we still changing the clocks, and how did we get here? Well, back in 1966, Congress passed the Uniform Time Act, establishing daylight saving time nationwide. By the way, it is saving, not savings. Oregon was already on board back then, having done the same 4 years before that. The idea to turn the clocks forward 1 hour on the last Sunday in April and then turn them back on the last Sunday in October. Basically, it lets humans make better use of daylight as the sun rises and sets later and later throughout the summer. The official time change happens at 2 a.m. when most of us, hopefully, are asleep. In 2005, Congress extended the daylight saving time window, scheduling us to spring forward in March and fall back in November. Well, a lot of people find these frequent time shifts kind of annoying. Some states like Arizona don't observe daylight saving time at all. In 2019, Oregon and Washington decided to take a page out of their book. But lawmakers instead passed a bill to keep both states on daylight saving time all year round. In other words, the schedule we use during the summer would become our schedule all year. But, and this is key, none of us can actually make that switch yet. Because for that to happen, we need approval from Congress and the president. In short, we're stuck in legislative limbo, waiting on D.C. However, Washington State Senator Patty Murray is now sponsoring a bill called the Sunshine Protection Act to make daylight saving time permanent all across the country. So we'll see where that goes. And that's how we got here. Turns out, people working from home last year did not make as big an impact cutting carbon emissions as we thought. So what's something that would help? Skylights and sunrooms.
The idea here is to let the energy in, to use it to heat up some materials inside the house.
And 60 years ago today, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke at Civic Auditorium right here in Portland. We'll dive into the KGW Vault when the story continues.
Welcome back. Keep sending your questions and comments to thestory@kgw.com or use the hashtag #TheStoryKGW on Twitter. We got this email from Martha about climate change. She wrote, "It seems to me that one of the logical steps that should be taken is to put people back in their houses again and work from home, because it was clear that the CO2 levels in the big cities went down significantly during the first part of the pandemic when everybody was forced off the streets. There were no cars and there was no commuting and the airlines were quiet." I got to tell you, I remember that, Martha, and I think you're right. The CO2 seemed like it did drop in those first few months of the lockdown. So would it help if we all worked from home again? Let's bring in our expert, Chief Meteorologist Matt Zaffino. What do you think?
It did drop, you're right, and Martha's right about that. If you recall, suddenly they were seeing like the mountains in Los Angeles and more like places like Beijing.
Yeah.
They could see the mountain ranges where they hadn't in a long, long time. But it is a pretty complex problem. So I'm going to show you one of the graphics I showed you back then during the pandemic, and this is satellite-based data on not CO2, but pollutant, nitrogen dioxide. And again, this was a fairly immediate turnaround by some of the NASA satellites showing the big decrease in northern China around Beijing when the lockdown happened. So you may think that's fantastic, and it was fantastic. CO2 is a little bit harder to measure. We do measure it. It is measured by satellites, but it took a little more time for scientists to kind of tease that one out. And there was a decrease. They measured about a 15 to 20% decrease in April of 2020. And for the first 4 months of 2020, January through April, about a 7% decrease worldwide in CO2. However, it's not quite that simple. This is an animation from NASA. Where it's blue, that's where CO2 was less. Where it's orange, that's where CO2 was more. The problem with this is it's a very complicated relationship between carbon dioxide and vegetation on our planet. It's called the atmosphere vegetation carbon exchange, and it really makes it difficult to tease out the signal as to what the reduction was. So what the NASA scientists did is they said, okay, let's take the measurement from April of 2020 and compare that on modeled baseline data, because obviously we didn't know. You couldn't measure what it was like normally because it wasn't normal, right? So they had to model what the normal was and then compare the two. See, it's getting complicated already. But what they did discover was a couple things here. First of all, the decrease from COVID, it is uncertain because the attribution is so difficult, as I've been trying to explain. And one of the reasons why is this: carbon dioxide stays in our atmosphere for hundreds of years, which is part of the climate change problem, right? It just lasts a really, really long time. So even as, was it Martha, suggests, if we were to shut everything down right now, there's something called commitment warming. We've already pumped so much CO2 into the atmosphere, we're committed to that much warming, even if everything that produced CO2 stopped right now. It's hard to separate the long-term changes from the short-term changes. So again, we've been putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. That short-term decrease because of COVID, it's hard to separate out that signal. NASA scientists work on that, but it's a very complex problem. It requires some of their best supercomputing and modeling that they have. And climate variability has a strong influence on, again, that vegetation-atmosphere exchange of carbon. So I know that's a lot to kind of take in. And think about it this way, though. Everything was shut down, right? I mean, we're still suffering supply chain issues because of that. Is it realistic to shut everything down and shut everybody in? That's a question you would have to ask yourself. But it did help in the short term. Whether it helped long term, we're not seeing that. The CO2 graph from Mauna Loa in Hawaii, which is one of our best measurements of carbon dioxide around the planet, still going up. And it's still way higher than it's been in millions of years. On a little more positive note, we were talking about the influence that solar panels, or even just, solar windows, can have on the energy budget of the atmosphere, right? And this is just the last couple days for Portland. Solar electricity generated by solar power, right? Look at this. Today, November 8th, we could have charged 115 million smartphones with the energy created and produced by solar power today. So that's a lot of energy that we produce by solar energy. Here's for Oregon from wind energy, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I mean, look at this. The amount of CO2 avoided by going to carbonless sources of energy is pretty profound. Back to you, Pat.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why he's the best in the city. Thank you, Matt.
You bet.
That's great. Hey, if you're looking for another way to cut down your carbon emissions, you might want to consider putting a skylight or sunroom into your home. A new study shows you can cut your heating costs by a third, along with your carbon footprint. Here's Keely Chalmers.
We have really been very happy with this.
It's Hildegard Van Regenworder's favorite room in her Beaverton home.
It's nice and warm.
Her sunroom. It not only provides a great place to entertain friends, it also provides warmth in the cold months.
Yeah, when it's real hot like today, I open up the 2 doors and the house gets heated too. It's been very nice.
Which is important when you consider most people spend about half their home energy budget on heating. In fact, heating is the biggest source of building-related carbon emissions, and most heating systems in the U.S. still rely on oil or natural gas.
For perspective, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions due to buildings in the U.S., residential buildings, is comparable to passenger car travel.
So University of Oregon researcher Alan Rempel and his wife Alexandra wanted to find out how much passive solar heating systems like sunrooms or skylights can cut down on electricity use.
The idea here is to let the energy in and to use it to heat up some materials inside the house.
The researchers found
if every house in the U.S. had 10 square meters of skylights, then the heating usage would be about a third of what it is currently.
But they also found it depends on where those skylights are placed, especially in cloudier places like the Pacific Northwest that get more diffused radiation.
And it turns out that tilted surfaces are better than vertical surfaces.
During the pandemic, the Rempels installed a set of skylights in their own home, as well as sliding insulation panels to keep the heat in at night. Their estimated savings?
And we think we're going to cut our heating bill by about half.
And Rempel says in places that don't get that cold in the winter, skylights alone could provide pretty much all the heating necessary.
That in a city like San Francisco, the amount of energy that you could capture is about equal to what you would need to heat over the course of a year.
Something that not only looks good, but is good for the planet. Keely Chalmers, KGW News.
I told you before, we love your questions. Keep them coming. Let's get to one from Jan. Is there any information yet that indicates if the efficacy of the COVID vaccine is better or worse if you get a different vaccine booster than your initial dose? I think that's something a lot of us are thinking about right now. Last month, the CDC approved mixing and matching booster shots. That's what the governor did, for example. That means if you originally got vaccinated with one brand, say Johnson & Johnson, then you can choose to get your booster with a different brand like Pfizer or Moderna. The FDA and CDC both say it's completely safe. But back to Jan's question. Basically, does it work better if you choose one booster over another? Well, the research is a little bit early still since booster shots are pretty new, but the National Institutes of Health did present a study to the FDA. First, they looked at people who initially got the J&J shot. When those people got a J&J booster, their antibody levels went up about 5 times, so that's good. But when they got a COVID booster from either Pfizer or Moderna, the antibody levels shot way, way, way up. In fact, they were more than 50 times higher after the Moderna booster, which is why I'm going to get that one. The study also looked at people who got either Pfizer or Moderna for their first round of vaccines. When they got a booster from one of those two brands, they had a similarly high immune response with the booster. So, based on early research, if you got J&J, you'll be better protected if you do mix and match your booster shot. Don't say you never learn anything here. Now, let's take a trip into the KGW vault. 60 years ago today, what a moment this would have been. November 8th, 1961, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to a crowd at the Civic Auditorium, which is now known as Keller Auditorium, in downtown Portland. The Multnomah County Library has this flyer advertising King's visit, which was in the Urban League newsletter. He also spoke at Portland State and Lewis and Clark College during his visit. We also found this photo of King meeting with local civil rights leaders at the Vancouver Avenue First Baptist Church. King discussed fair housing issues in the Albina neighborhood, where much of Portland's black population lived because they could not get loans to buy homes in other parts of the city, an illegal practice called redlining. If you have an idea for our vault, please let us know. Send an email to thestory@kgw.com. We're going to finish the story right after this. I want to remind you about our Hey Help campaign. This week we're asking you to consider donating to North Star Clubhouse. They're a recovery program in Northeast Portland for people who have experienced a mental health crisis. To donate, just hold your phone's camera up to the QR code there on your screen. It'll take you to the donation page. You can also go to kgw.com/heyhelp. Pick up your phone, follow us on Twitter @TheStoryKGW, or email thestory@kgw.com. Hey, that's the end of the story. Let's bring in Laurel Porter now.
Hi, Pat. Thank you. We're taking a look at confusion over a sales tax proposal in Clark County that would have funded officer body cameras. The news at 6:30 starts now.
This is KGW.